Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulli, and with me today is our frequent and most famous guest of this channel, Father John Whiteford. How are we doing today?
Doing good. How about yourself?
Doing good. I remember the good old days when every time the Protestants said something very silly and had to put their foot in their mouth, we'd have a response video. But apparently it's become such a cottage industry, and there's so many, I think we've just lost count at this point.
Yeah, it's hard to keep up with all the silly things that you see Protestants saying these days.
It's there was a It's Not Truth Unites anymore, a Gavin Ortlund video on like what the liturgy looked like in the year 150. And of course the idea is like, well, it's not really liturgical and stuff. And it's like, it's kind of hard to respond to some of these things. You know, we've already kind of done the very in detail responses with the rhetorical sleight of hands and things like this. And so in a sense,
if you look at a video of Gavin Ortlund's church when he was the head of his own church out, I think, in California, one thing you know is it didn't look like that.
No.
It was rock bands and the whole bit. So he tries to talk about liturgical worship as if he's got some connection with the ancient Christian tradition when his actual practice is about as far from it as you can get.
Yeah, and it's just, how do you respond to every little piece of misinformation? And it's just, it reaches a point, which is part of a larger issue, obviously, that we've have a situation where there's so much just content out there. People have lost the ability to discern like what is good, what's not.
Right.
And you just sort of hope that you stick with certain brand names, like, you know, for better, for worse, I'll just say like Trent Horn. You know, he's not going to say something totally ridiculous, right? You know, he got where he is doing what he does to give you a perspective there. And I'd like to think that, not that I'm perfect, but people come to me and know, all right, well, Craig's going to be fairly careful with the sources and give a perspective and try to rely on those resources instead of every random thing. And I do think, sadly, in the Dr. Ortlund's case, this is one where he's been in detail shown to be incorrect, and in some cases outright misportraying things that he's been told directly. Let's say my position on certain things, and he says, no, Craig says something else, things like this, where it gets to the point like, okay, I'm not sure if I would actually say this is a good area for you to get alternate information from if you're weighing the different sides, because the person's not acting in good faith. But the point of the stream wasn't like to talk about that. It's like, well, why do Craig and Father John do less videos? It's sort of like it would be too many to do if we kind of stuck to our old routine. But there's an even older routine, which is the good old Stump the Priest segment on your blog, which you've been doing for years, as far as I can tell. So we're going to be doing a Stump a Priest tonight. And so this is your opportunity, audience. Write questions. Try to stump Father John Whiteford. And as we wait for those questions, I want to get your reaction to what I thought was a pretty cute video. And I say cute because just look at this couple. You have like, he doesn't know it, but like a future Orthodox influencer, if you hear his voice and how he explains himself, he's very good, but doesn't know it. And from what I could tell, his wife's vlog, like, you know, kind of like a throwback to the 2010s when people actually vlogged with their just opinions on random topics. And they're a young Christian couple discerning orthodoxy. And if you get into the actual video, you find out that she was discerning at first and then kind of was turned off from it. And then he got to it. And now they're kind of this sort of polite loggerheads. So I wanted to play some things because I kind of thought that, Father, you know, you're in a real parish situation, obviously, but as the pastor of the parish, is this something common you run into where the husband is dead set about becoming Orthodox and then it's the wife that's reticent?
I've ran into that many cases. I've ran into a few cases where it was the other way around, but it's certainly more common for the man to be the one who's interested in the wife or girlfriend is not.
And I guess, you know, I'll start playing this and we'll ask you, well, how would you respond in this situation? How would you address their concerns? Because it's probably something you've already done before. So I'll get going and let me know if there's any audio issues.
The things that have been carried through the church. If you go to a divine liturgy versus something like an evangelical service, you'll see a lot more of an emphasis on the hymnography and the prayer. And a lot less of the emphasis on a sermon. Obviously, at an Orthodox church, there's an altar, there are priests, there are deacons, there's bishops. So a lot more of the church structure that's described within the scriptures when they talk about presbyters, deacons, and obviously like Paul and Timothy were apostle, or Paul is an apostle, but the apostles kind of acted as bishops in the first centuries of the church. So they would go and ordain new people to be bishops, like Timothy, for example, of the church in Ephesus. Some people will say like, oh, it's holier. It feels more holy or something. But really what they're trying to get at is there's a lot higher view of the sacraments. So of communion or the Eucharist, of baptism, of apostolic succession. So priests needing to be, they go through seminary, but not only that, they're highly trained. The priesthood, like that is their full-time job oftentimes, and they're there to serve the church. There's confession.
I just found that funny. He says it's the priest's full-time job. Maybe not a lot of priests in roll corps, but so there you go. He thinks it's the full-time job, but let me just keep going until we hear a comment. We're kind of hearing him unpack the things he thinks are good about Orthodoxy, and then we'll kind of see the dynamic, what she thinks about it.
A lot of things that are just very foreign in kind of the church that we're in now. So
what was the thing that kind of, or I guess like what is the biggest difference that drew you to more Orthodoxy compared to like what our church is now, and like I guess just like what that looked like? Yeah, it's
a good question. Largely, I mean, it's a culmination of things, but I think when you get to, like I said, this is me voicing my opinion, so I'm not trying to debate, I'm not trying to state a fact, I'm not trying to make a crazy strong truth claim here, but I mean, for me, I think the Orthodox Church and the way the early church fathers, the Eastern Christians, thought about the church make a lot more sense because they start from the bottom up rather than the top down. So they don't start from reading scriptures and saying Ephesians 2:8-9, like it says we're saved by faith alone, so let's go back and like make everything else make sense within that framework. But rather they start from Christology, who is Christ, what is the church, what is our doctrine of God, what is our doctrine of the Trinity, and how does everything else fit within that? Because if you're building a Jenga tower, you don't start from the top. You don't open a Lego book and to build a Lego and you go to the very end, because then you're going to run into some issues. You might use pieces in the wrong place. And I'm not saying that that's a perfect analogy, but largely,
if you sit more than 6 hours.
Well, I don't know. We're going to, if you sit in the cushion too long, maybe I'll stop it there for now because we got some questions coming. But I'll say, let me ask you this question first, Father John. 10 years ago, because you've been a priest since the late 90s, if I remember right. 10 years ago, a couple like this walks in your church. Would either of them sound this well-versed in these sort of examples in theology? Would their concerns be aligned like his? Or is this something new?
Well, it certainly is new that you have people coming in on day one. They already know a lot about the Orthodox Church. I used to get very basic questions when people would come for the first time. But I've had people visit the church for the first time and then ask me that, to be made a catechumen, because they already know what a catechumen is and they know what they want to become one. And, I don't make them a catechumen usually that quickly. I give them things to go over first. But, the fact that people are self-catechizing, before they even enter the church is a new thing, and there's good aspects to it. There's some I think that's part of why you're having such a big influx, is people are finding out about Orthodoxy online. It's certainly much more visible, and I think as much as people like Gavin Ortland and Roman Catholic apologists that are trying to take shots at Orthodoxy on their channels might think they're trying to stem the flow, I think they're actually increasing the flow, because there's lots of people who might not have heard about Orthodoxy except the fact that they're talking about it. And then people start paying attention to when they see a debate coming up. And then when they see a debate with someone who knows what they're talking about, it becomes pretty evident that the Orthodox have history and the facts on their side. And and these Roman Catholics and Protestants are grasping at straws. And So I think that's why you're seeing this big influx. So that's a good thing. Sometimes when you have people who are self-catechizing, they're not always going to come in with the proper understanding. So you've got to correct some stuff too.
What impresses me, other than his good radio voice, right? Like they just pulled this guy like out of nowhere. And he can literally have his own YouTube channel tomorrow, and people would probably watch it, and it's not even a catechumen.
Right.
But it's just such a cogent response that we start with Christology and triadology and the things that you often hear. And I could tell you that when I came into the church, and I would say I'm more well-read than the average person, but I wasn't thinking about it theologically that advanced.
Right.
And it seems that people already have this sort of synthesized view of orthodoxy, where they already have this holistic view that's already been presented and they've assimilated. And what I find interesting on top of this is the fact that there's people that aren't Orthodox that invest themselves to even get that deep in the weeds. That's, I think, kind of new. So it's interesting there. I saw that video there, and I found interesting the main objections. Let me pose this to you. And the wife's objection there was that I cannot accept that Orthodoxy thinks that they are the true church and thereby everyone else isn't. And that was her objection. And this is one where I have to admit, I don't understand the compelling nature of that objection, even feelings wise. But I'm well aware that this is apparently very compelling to tons of people. It's literally, let's say, not to make everything about Gavin Ortlund. I'm not trying to make that Dr. Ortlund, but I think he's a good example where that's essentially his whole polemic, is that any exclusive claims of orthodoxy somehow invalidate orthodoxy, which is, to me, not a truth claim. You would have to weigh whether the claim is true, whether to invalidate the church, not that this sounds okay, I don't agree with it. But apparently this is a real concern for people. So like, have you run into this, Father? And how would you address it? How you addressed in the past, or how would you address it in the future?
I think it's a common issue, because if you grow up as a Protestant or even a Catholic in a country like the United States, where you're surrounded with people who have different denominational backgrounds or even different religions, it's difficult for people to imagine that there could be a true faith that people have to adhere to. And, so they want to cast a wide net. And so, most evangelical Protestants say, well, the Protestants are okay. Some would even be so bold to say, well, maybe there's some Catholics that are going to go to heaven too. But only because they're not believing what their church teaches them, usually, is what they'd say. But the key question that needs to be asked is what did the church always believe about itself? Almost every Protestant that knows anything about church history would say, yeah, we believe in the Nicene Creed. Well, the Nicene Creed says, I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So if a Protestant knows something about biblical exegesis, were to give that some thought, the way that Protestants are taught to understand the Bible is you ask the question, what did that mean to the people who wrote it? And so if you ask the question, what did the Nicene Creed mean to the fathers that composed the creed? They clearly did not believe that it included all the heretics and schismatics that they have canons talking about how these people should be received into the church about. So the church has always believed that there is a church that is in commune with itself, and that if you're not in that church, then you're outside of the church. Now, I think the thing is, we don't therefore make the leap and say that everybody that's not in the church is going to roast in hell for all eternity. And I think that's, for Protestants, that's typically the way they look at it, is either you're saved or you're going to roast in hell. So if you're saying I'm not part of the church, that means you're saying I'm going to roast in hell. And that's not what we teach.
It's taken as a personal sort of insult.
Right.
Now, like, what I don't hear from the Protestant side is, for example, because they care about heresies, right? Jehovah's Witnesses are a heresy. You say, well, do Jehovah's Witnesses go to hell? They'd probably say yes. I can't tell you about each and every one of them, but it's a class of people, yes. If I were to say whether or not people who are unbelievers go to hell, Protestants would nod their head yes. Unbelievers go to hell. And what I found interesting is I finished reading this with my son. He read the whole set of C.S. Lewis books on Narnia on his own.
Right.
And something in the end of The Last Battle caught my eye. So I figured, you know what, I'll read the whole book together with him. And not, you know, we read plenty of secular entertainment, which is you get nothing of any edifying value from. And so I would say C.S. Lewis is a million times better than that, but I'll just put it plainly. C.S. Lewis is a heretic. I'm not saying to be mean. The sort of like, how could he say C.S. Lewis would go to hell? And neither, honestly, should we. That's a mistake I made, just not thinking that hard about a question once. We don't know what he believed the moment before he died. It's between him and God. But I'll say this is a heretical book if we're going to compare to what's good Christian doctrine.
Right.
Within The Last Battle, one of the people that doesn't worship Aslan, he worships Tash. He dies, he goes to Aslan, and Aslan says, whatever you worship, Tash, I receive as my own. So the idea is the well-meaning people among the pagans and the unbelievers out there, the infidels, so to say, they could go to heaven too if they were well-meaning, which as a Protestant, the faith alone types, that should rub you the wrong way because, you know, what God saves good people. I thought good works had nothing to do with it. But also, like, if I didn't say this was C.S. Lewis, I just said it was William Lane Craig, or it was, who's the New Perspective and Paul guy that they like hating?
N.T. Wright.
Yeah, N.T. Wright, or someone else to be like, he's a heretic, you know. If it was, you know, if it was James White, or if it was, you know, insert, because they have disputes among, you know, Anthony Rogers, they have disputes among certain Protestant influencers. They go, well, he's a heretic, but this is C.S. Lewis, right? This is the one where if you say, well, C.S. Lewis might go to hell because he's not in the church, they'd be like, well, how could he say such an awful thing? I liked his book when I was a kid. And of course, I sincerely hope he's in heaven, but he's a heretic. And if you can't say heretics go to hell, that puts all, what are we doing here in theology? What are we even talking about here? And so the statement heretics go to hell is something we should agree with. And we should be able to agree with that classes of heretics go to hell, the Jehovah's Witnesses, this or that heresy, you go to hell. And I think that what people don't like is when the heresy hits close to home. And at least for me, that made me repent when I found that out. Some people would rather not be told, and actually comes up in this video, by the way, the young couple. He said, if you had a cancer and I had, he calls it the antidote, but like if I had the cure to the cancer, is it not loving for me to tell you this is the cure, you must take the cure? And of course, that's the loving thing to say. It might hurt your feelings to hear it. And so that being said, this is one of those polemics, which it's emotional appeal. It's very effective. And hearing me on a YouTube channel or hearing whomever else might not be the right way to address each person's pastoral situation. Right. This is something that obviously we'd address on an individual basis, the individual's concerns. We would validate whatever good things outside the church they have or have had with their family members and things like this. You know, quite frankly, The Last Battle is a beautiful book. I'd recommend it to everyone. Just don't get every aspect of theology from it, right? So it's not that we aren't going to say there's not redeeming things outside the church or anything like that. But it's a very powerful objection. I can't say I fully get it. We should, you know, on an intellectual basis, but it's out there. And sadly, people make hay on it, but they don't actually address the intellectual concern. So that's my comments on that. I don't know if anything you want to add because we got some questions now.
Well, St. Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about how God will judge those outside the church. And so it's not the job of the church to say or to make pronouncements about the eternal destiny of anybody individually, unless, you know, God reveals that some kind of way. Like, Judas, I think his eternal fate, we have a pretty good beat on. And, but, you know, there's there's an icon. I think I probably mentioned it on your show before, but I was at Erie, the Old Rite Parish, where all the icons are inscribed in English, so it's kind of nice because you can actually read everything easily. And they had an icon, in the west wall. They had the icon of the Last Judgment, but there was one element of the icon that I'd never seen before, and it had a man whose arms were tied around a pillar behind his back, and there was an angel with a scroll, and the angel was the scroll the angel was holding, and says, because of your fornication you are denied entry into the kingdom of heaven, but because of your charity you're spared the torments of hell. And I went to Romania a few years ago and saw that very same icon in a much older church. So that this is an icon that's been around for a while. And I think that one thing that this tells you is that there's a lot of room for something between people roasting in hell for all eternity, and everybody is the same. We're all going to be in with the saints for all eternity. That are possibilities, because we believe that God's judgment is just and that his sentence on the day of judgment will be appropriate, and no one's going to be able to sit back and justly accuse God of being unjust in any sentence that he gives anyone. And so God desires the salvation of everyone, and we believe that there's extraordinary means by which God could choose to save someone. But the thing is, and we can't say, here's how you can be saved outside the church, because we're talking about some extraordinary means by which God might save someone based on just the light that they've been given and God knowing their heart and all that. But we can say how people can be saved in the church. So that's the gospel. That's what we proclaim to the world, because here's a sure path. So I would never tell someone, you might be saved outside the church, so try your luck. I think that would be a dumb thing for people to do.
And we have this comment where it says, if you die outside of the church, is it possible that God could extraordinarily bind you to the church after death, thus still being saved within the church? And all I could say from the hagiographies, generally speaking, we have these characters outside the church that are saved. An angel reveals to them the gospel. They have some sort of repentance. There's things like this. And, what exact quality that takes and how often that takes, we don't judge those things. I think the most extreme example is and I spoke to Father George Maximoff about this, and he's against this example, but we have saints like St. Mark of Ephesus in favor of it, which is the salvation of Trajan, the Roman emperor.
Right.
As far as we know, he was in hell, according to the hagiography. He was prayed out of hell by St. Gregory the Great. And I know there's a little more to hagiography and some development, which is kind of common with hagiography, some embellishments that occurred over time. But that being said, it becomes an accepted truism that Trajan's in heaven. St. Mark of Ephesus presumes upon this. Dante presumes upon this. So I'll just say this. Pagan emperor persecuting Christians could go to heaven. My Roman Catholic grandmother, your mother, whomever who died outside the church, at least has a better chance than that guy through something extraordinary.
Right.
But we're,
Yeah, and the thing is, whether the Emperor Trajan is sitting around the same table with Christ and the apostles, in the kingdom of heaven, or whether he's in some state that's short of that, I mean, who knows? But he's certainly, we believe that he was saved in some sense. And
he's definitely better off than he was.
Right. And so I pray for non-Orthodox family members that have passed away all the time, and I pray because I believe that God's merciful and he hears those prayers. But I can't make a pronouncement about it. If I was St. Gregory the Dialogist, maybe God would reveal it to me, but that hasn't happened yet. So
you open this topic, and there's so many things to talk about. Obviously, the objection is put forward by someone who's a Calvinist, which is awfully bizarre because the theology dedicates to the fact there's people that won't be saved no matter what, right? It's not even their will where they could be saved.
Yeah, they can't do a thing about it.
And it's but that's not mean, for some reason that's mean, and to me that doesn't invalidate it. I think the Orthodox, I don't take their view seriously by saying, oh, it makes God horrible, this, that. But you have to take the theology at its merits and then evaluate the merits. You can't just say it's ucky. That's not an argument.
Right. I mean, theoretically, it's certainly true that the God of the universe could have determined for all eternity who would go to heaven and who would go to hell. There's nothing they could do about it. But I would just say that that's not the God that you find in the Bible, and it's certainly not the God that you find, taught by the apostles and the saints of the early church or any period thereafter until you get to the Protestant Reformation, which is obviously outside of the church.
I actually believe that to be anthropologically impossible. If we understand what humanity really is, what human will really is, what grace really is, and how humanity receives that grace. But at principle, I understand your point. But it's interesting in predestination. One of the most interesting things I ever read, one of the homilies, St. Gregory Palamas. And St. Gregory Palamas says that God forbears generations of reprobates, people who go to hell, terrible people, because a saint would come from the line. And it makes me think this, I'll pose you the question, what has more dignity? What's more important, a tree or a person? It's obvious, person, right?
Right.
Well, what has more dignity, a bad person or a good person?
You would say a good person.
A good person, right? We're dealing with common sense here.
Right.
It's not. There's no gotcha here. What is more dignity? The good person or a million awful people?
Well, I'd say the good person has more dignity, but in terms of, the value that God places on the human soul, I don't know that would.
The million awful people are more important than the tree. Is my point,
yeah.
right?
Right.
But the holy person has more value than the million that aren't holy. And so then it gets the question, well, what has more value? The very holy person or the holy person?
Yeah, you'd think the very holy
holy person. And so when I meditate upon just the idea, I think of the Mother of God, right? Who could have more dignity and more value than the Mother of God among men that aren't incarnate, obviously, right? And so I can't remember where I've read this, but if it's nowhere, I think it's true enough. If Christ came simply just to save his mother, which is, we know that's much more than that. But if it was just her, it would have been more than worth it. That God would have forbear the whole human race if it meant just the Mother of God. Now we know there's much more than that. So I think oftentimes our objections are based upon a very limited understanding of what has value, how people attain to holiness. Like, for example, what is holiness? Just never having any problems, no sins, like a baby, or overcoming sin, overcoming temptation, overcoming difficulties. I would say the latter has more value than simply just being born a blank slate. And so if we saw these things to the perspective God has, and we have, there'd be no objection. A lot of these objections are just very man-centered and very actual individual-centered. We look at ourselves as the measure of these things. I wouldn't want that to happen to me. Instead of what God's looking at, which is the saints and the salvation of as many holy people as possible, I would say. So, I mean, that's just my own meditations upon that, but it's something to reflect upon, because St. Gregory Palamas said God would forbear all these reprobates, so one saint, because that one saint's worth more than them. Doesn't mean the other people aren't worth anything. They're worth more than, I'd say, the smartest dolphin in the world, more than Flipper. Remember Flipper?
Right.
But that being said, let's get to questions for Father. We have this. How close is the EP trying to Jimmy rig a false union between Roman Orthodoxy in your view?
A what?
He's trying to say jerry rig a false union. Is that anywhere
close?
A
false union. Okay.
Yeah, we've seen like
well, I mean, it certainly does.
This claim, and
it certainly does seem like that's their intention, and I think that people need to be paying attention to that, because you might think, well, maybe that's just diplomatic talk or something like that. But I think all of these, hobnobbing with heretics events that they go to and stuff like that are designed to get people used to the idea before they pull the trigger, but I do think they're going to do it at some point.
Well, remember the ecumenical patriarch was giving everyone a tree.
Yeah.
The tree said dignity. We have this. Thoughts on the ritual hypothesis for the Nephilim's conception posited by Seraphim Hamilton and Father Stephen DeYoung. It's meant to reconcile the two prevailing interpretations, Genesis 6. Do you have any opinions on that, Father?
Well, I'd never paid attention to the Lord of Spirits podcast for probably a year or two. And then one day I didn't have anything else to do, so I downloaded an episode and was listening to it, and I thought, this is some crazy crap. I need to write an article refuting all this stuff. And I thought, well, before I write that article, I should probably go back to the beginning of this podcast and listen to all the episodes and see what they're really getting to. And, the more I listened to it, the more I thought, well, this is not as much crazy crap as I thought. The one thing about that, because I do think that there's a lot of, I've learned a lot from listening to Father Stephen DeYoung, but I also think that he sometimes overstates his case a bit. And I wish that when he would talk about views like that he would say something to the effect of, this is not what you find the Father's teaching. But I have heard him explain, well, like there's this one view, most of the Fathers say, no, the daughters, the sons of God are the line of Shem.
Yeah.
But then you've got some fathers that say, no, these are actually the offspring of these fallen angels. And so he'll say, well, look, the reason why most of the fathers reject this is because they say, well, angels are bodiless, so how could they produce children? Well, here's a way that it could happen without that being an issue. That sounds like a plausible possibility to me. I just wish that when he would talk about it, that he would make it very clear when he's talking about it that this is not something you actually find the Father saying. This is, a theory that he has, which may
like an attempted harmonization.
Yeah, it may be true, but I think it's always good that when you're saying something that you can't back up with, the Father say, you should probably put it in a little bit more conditional terms than stating absolute things. And actually, I've been meaning to write an article on the subject, and I might get to it next week. I'm going to try. But one thing that I found very irritating that he has a bad habit of getting into is the question comes up is the Septuagint superior to the Masoretic text? And he'll say, oh, no, in the Orthodox Church, we don't believe that. That's absolutely a baseless statement. The churches, for one thing, you look at the Orthodox Study Bible, read the introduction to it, look at all the people who are involved in producing the Orthodox Study Bible. Why did they bother? They felt like the Orthodox Study Bible should be a translation based on the Septuagint. Unfortunately, they didn't always follow the Septuagint as closely as they should have. But that was what they were trying to produce, was an English translation of the Septuagint and the full Orthodox canon. And if the Masoretic text is just as good as the Septuagint text, they could have just produced the Roman Catholic version of the RSV Old Testament, and it would have been okay according to Father Stephen DeYoung's calculations. But we don't believe that. And there's many examples. One thing I've heard him say this several times. He'll say, well, the Russian translation of the Bible is based on the Masoretic text. Gotcha. Well, I read a book after I heard him make this comment. I read a book on the subject because I wanted to see what the history of it was. It's called Russian Bible Wars. I believe we got it on the shelf there. And it's all about
Sounds Russian. There's a war involved.
Well, but the thing is, there was a lot of conflict over, are we going to translate from the Septuagint or the Masoretic text? And basically, Tsar Nicholas I actually forbade a translation from the Masoretic text. But when he passed away and was replaced, I think it was either Alexander II or the Third, I think was his successor. He authorized them to go ahead and do a translation of the Masoretic text, although the deuterocanonical books were translated from the Septuagint. And why did he do that? Well, the reason why he did that is you had a lot of, Russian intelligentsia that were influenced by their friends in Western Europe. And a lot of them were reading translations of the Bible in other languages because they could read French, they could read English, they could read German. And they wanted to have a translation of the same text in Russian, but they were convinced by things they were hearing from other people that the Masoretic text was superior to the Septuagint. And the Russian church went ahead and allowed this text to be published. And this happened under St. Philaret of Moscow. But St. Philaret of Moscow stated very specifically it's the Slavonic translation of the Bible that is the authoritative text. So, and the Slavonic translation is a translation of the Septuagint. So when he made that statement, he was making very clear the church is not saying the Masoretic text is as good or better than the Septuagint. He basically he had a czar that was inclined for that to be done, and he was living in a state where the church was under the influence of the czar more than it would have been prior to Peter the Great. And so they went along with it, and they produced a good translation. I think I read translations from the Masoretic text on a regular basis, but I also read translations based on the Septuagint. And I know that if there's a difference, it's the Septuagint text that's a more authoritative text. So I just wish that he would not make statements like that and then try to palm that off as if that's the view of the Orthodox Church when it's his opinion. It's not. It's clearly not the position of the church because, again, look at the Orthodox Study Bible. Why did it come into being? Look at all the bishops, including Antiochian bishops, that had a big hand in that. They wouldn't have bothered if it wasn't necessary.
Yeah, I'm personally more ambivalent on the question, a text by text basis, and this is something where hopefully Yoon and Father will talk it out in a way which, because people on the internet, they'll blow these things out of proportion. But I think of the book of Job, and with the book of Job, most of the commentaries written by the saints, if they're old enough, are going to be based on the Masoretic text. So like Masoretic text, rather the Septuagint. So like Augustine's commentary is based on the Old Latin, which is the Septuagint. St. John Chrysostom's Septuagint. But when you get to obviously what the church esteems as the most important of the commentaries, St. Gregory the Great's, it's based on the Vulgate, which is essentially a Latin version of a kind of something, a proto-Masoretic text.
Right.
And the Septuagint itself is unlike the most Septuagint, which is based upon earlier versions of the Hebrew, and it's been like captured in Greek, let's say 2nd century BC. The book of Job in the Septuagint is based upon an Aramaic Targum, and even explicitly says so in the introduction. This is not some sort of like scholarly thing. The book says so if you read it. So this is one of those situations where I would say we have enough diversity with the saints and the text they're using where we could kind of discern the question, what has priority here? And I personally land on the Masoretic for that book. It's more clearly Christological in many points. But that being said, if we're going to go by what and by the way, it also, Masoretic conforms more to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which usually Septuagint renderings conform more to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right. Well, the fathers, most of them could not read Hebrew, but they did have access to translations into Greek that were from the Hebrew text. And so they had a pretty good idea what the Hebrew text said from those other Greek translations. And often when they're commenting on a passage of scripture, they'll say, well, in the Hebrew text, it says this, and then they'll give an interpretation of that text. Because I think they acknowledge that sometimes the Hebrew text might be interesting or even informative. So I don't have a problem with that. But the thing is, if you're talking about generally speaking, which text is the authoritative text, it's the Septuagint, certainly more so than the Masoretic text. I mean, I think Father Seraphim Slobodskoy in the Law of God, he talks about what are the authoritative texts of the Bible, and I believe that, if I'm remembering correctly, he says the Septuagint, the Syriac Peshitta, the Vulgate, and the Slavonic text. Well, obviously, those texts don't always align perfectly, but these are all texts that were preserved within the church. And
and it shows you, if the church preserved it, you're not saved by, I got to find the most perfect rendering and get to the bottom of the question. That God preserved what was efficacious for our salvation. And
Right.
that'd be true of all those major texts.
So, I mean, I think ideally, and I'll tell you something else about the Septuagint text, and unfortunately, I've just not seen enough good information to really satisfy my curiosity on the subject. But I've learned, when it comes to the New Testament text, to not trust modern textual critics, generally speaking, because I think that a lot of their criteria are a bit suspicious. And for example, one of their principles is the text that's the most awkward, difficult text is more likely to be original than than one that's a smoother reading. Well, the thing is, if somebody garbled a text because they were not paying attention when they were copying it down, it's obviously going to be a more difficult text. But according to their criteria, that would automatically give it a leg up on all the other texts. I think that if you have lots of textual evidence to support a difficult reading, that might be a good argument to make. But if you've got very slight evidence for a difficult text, that's not a good argument.
I mean, some of these are very messy. Like, for example, the longer ending of Mark being not original because two early Bibles from the 4th century lacked the longer ending. And
every other manuscript, except there's actually one late minuscule manuscript, and there's a few minority texts in other translations that also don't have it. But the vast majority of manuscripts do have it, and the Diatessaron
not only that, it's you were going to talk about the Diatessaron.
And the Diatessaron was done by a 2nd century heretic, but the thing is, that does give you a time frame in which that text had to be around for him to have included it. And that's older than these earliest and most reliable manuscripts, as they like to refer to them.
And St. Irenaeus also quotes from it.
Right.
So this is one of those things where this should have been dead in the water before it was speculated about. It's just sort of like the theory, which no one holds to anymore, but people held to when the Protestant Reformation began, which is all the letters of St. Ignatius at Antioch are forgeries. Now, the fact that in a few sections they're quoted by St. Justin Martyr and St. Irenaeus, that should have been dead in the water.
Right.
It's one thing to say, there might be, less letters, something like that, but this is one of those academic theories, and there would have been like sort of an early version of academia, so to say, that it should have been dead in the water. And so, like some of these textual critical arguments are they're awful.
But what I was starting to say, though, what I was trying to get to is on the question of the Septuagint text. You can get a Greek Bible that's published by, I think, the Soter Brotherhood in Greece, and it has the patriarchal text of the New Testament, which I think is probably what any Orthodox translation of the New Testament should be based on. Although I think it's good, like the Eastern Orthodox Bible, to have lots of footnotes where you're noting these differences. But the difference between the patriarchal text of the Greek New Testament and the Textus Receptus that the King James was based on is pretty minimal. I mean, there's some differences, but they're not significant. But in the Old Testament, they just use Ralph's edition of the Greek Septuagint. And the thing is, I'm not so sure that we should assume that Ralph's Septuagint reflects the standard edition of the Septuagint that the church preserved. I don't know, because I don't have the skills nor the time to investigate that. But I do hope that we'll have some Orthodox scholars that will start digging into that more to see how close is this text really to the text that you would find in a typical Greek monastery on Mount Athos, in the last, 1,000 years.
Yeah, it's going to be that young guy from the video, the young wife, right? He sounds like he's a future scholar. So to spice things up a bit, I was called out for my flipper heresy. How dare I say flipper has less dignity than that guy on death row? So there you go. You're entitled to your opinion. heresy to say anything bad about Flipper. We have even James White had started to address orthodoxy lately. And I have a debate coming up with Pastor James White. I invite everyone watching this, get your plane tickets and watch us in or around Phoenix, Arizona. It's like Scottsdale or, one of those little towns right outside of Phoenix. It'd be great to see you guys there. It's going to be a great debate on Nicaea 2, whether or not icons are apostolic. And I'm happy to see James White engage. He said something interesting, which is something worth heeding and taking serious, that orthodoxy is just a fad. It's something people are interested online, and then they'll move on to the next thing. Well, this could be the case if people don't step up spiritually, don't evangelize, don't invite their loved ones to church, don't attend church. We don't want this to be just an online only thing. We want people to be attending the services. So let's make it not a fad or fun thing to talk about the internet, but something that really is part of our lives.
Well, I think you have to be pretty ignorant of the history of the Orthodox Church in the United States to say it's just a fad that's popped up in the last couple of years. I mean, it's certainly their awareness of Orthodoxy is something that's increased quite a bit. But there have been people coming into the Orthodox Church for a very long time in this country.
I think I can see where he's coming from. I think his point more is it's not like, let's say, when Ron Paul ran for president, there was no paleoconservative movement in the United States. There was a John Birch Society, and these things existed for decades. But it was the first time where you really were getting that on a national level. And then a lot of the ultimate platform was usurped and modified ultimately by Donald Trump. So it's it could have been a fad, a flash in the pan. And also it's somewhat of a cautionary tale. You could lose the purity of what it is, and it could be adapted and co-opted by something else. So I kind of see where he's coming from. I don't think his point is that there's no Orthodox in the United States. One of the founding fathers, so to say, was Orthodox. It's more that all of a sudden people care among the normies. That obviously is new. There we go.
Bloodwell III. By the way, the Philip Bloodwell III conference, September the 12th in Falls of Roe, Kentucky. SouthernOrthodox.org.
So there you go. If you only got X dollars, you got to decide where you're flying, Kentucky or Arizona. So there you go.
Right.
We have this question. Is something like the phasing out of the seemingly universal practice holy kiss among laity anything to object to? Your view, Father?
Repeat that question again.
We don't do the holy kiss anymore. Is that a problem?
Well, the clergy do it. I think the practice of having the laity
do it. Any real Russian or Romanian?
Well, I mean, they don't do it in the services, but I think that certainly is something that's a real thing in the Orthodox Church. Is that if you greet another Orthodox Christian, the practice is you do the 3 air kisses with that person and give them a hug. That's pretty common, but to do it liturgically is not something that has been done probably for more than 1,000 years, maybe a lot longer than that. And I think the attempt to reinstitute it has some problems. Years ago, I stayed in Dallas when I had some reason to be there with some woman who was Russian background, and she was going to St. Seraphim's Cathedral in Dallas, and she was a single woman. And she told me, I was with my wife, by the way, if anyone's going to question why I was there.
I was like, Father, this story's not starting well.
But she was telling me that her and some other friend of hers, every time the kiss of peace is given, duck out of the church because all the single men were, hunting them down, trying to give them the kiss of peace. And so I think that's probably gives you an idea why maybe it stopped being a thing in the church.
I think, again, it depends on the culture. Like among, not to be racist, but among Hispanics, no one even think anything of it.
If you still had men on one side of the church and women on the other side of the church, which was the historic norm, and the kiss of peace was confined to those respective sections, I don't think that you would have a problem with that.
Yeah, I mean,
but when you have single guys, hunting down hot women to give them the kiss of peace, obviously that's not lifting people's hearts up to the Lord in the middle of the liturgy.
or any woman for that matter.
Right.
But but it's what was it? It's this, I think, speaks to a larger thing, which I think we need to be honest about. And I think it's problematic to a degree. It's not a deal breaker. It's not going to be the end of the world. But Father Daniel Sazoyev speaks about that in the whatever Russian liturgical book, that the laity are supposed to raise their hands during the Our Father. But he said, no one knows this anymore. No one does this anymore. Don't do it if it's going to cause a scandal to people. And so some of these correct practices that have been mostly lost, again, not in every context, but mostly lost, again, like the United States, the fact that we have gendered sides, other than monasteries, you really don't have that in the United States.
Right.
But you'd still have that with the Antiochians in the Middle East and certain places of Greece and Russia and things like this. There's a reason why these practices were in place, and the loss of these practices aren't going to end the world. Like, God's not OCD, but doing things not in conformity with what God prescribes is not going to have long-term good effects. It's going to lead to little issues. Like, if a woman doesn't wear a head covering, it's not that the world's going to end tomorrow. But is this a good thing? I don't think so. And so that speaks to a larger thing. You know, I think it's wrong thing to say is, well, how much could we get rid of and not have existential problems? I think rather the question should be, how do we increase the faithfulness of our practice without doing it in a weird way? And
well, I think generally speaking, I mean, you can have a practice that's an aberration. And so obviously if there's some local church that's doing something that is not done anywhere else, then maybe people should question whether that practice ought to continue. But when you have a standard practice that's developed in the church, I think that trying to do liturgical archaeology and say, well, people in the early church used to raise their hands at this point, so let's all do that now. It starts becoming kind of a weird thing. And I know in the old Wright parish when I was there that they actually do have a practice of people raising their hands, at least when they're censed. And I don't remember if they raise their hands during the Our Father or not.
the Antiochians definitely do.
It's something that they've instituted, but it's not like an ancient practice.
Yeah, this is one of those things where it was the ancient practice and went away, and then because it kind of creeped in because of Roman Catholicism, it come back. It's and then what's the ethos of that? So it's a more nuanced question in that respect.
Well, even in the altar among the clergy, it's normally only the celebrant that raises their hands at various points, and they actually don't raise their hands during the Lord's Prayer. It's but there are points in the service where they do raise their hands, but it's only the celebrant. So if you know, in my parish, I've got a younger priest and then a much older priest, and when me and the younger priest take turns serving first, well, if he's serving first, I'm not raising my hands at that point because he's celebrating. I'm serving with him, but he's the primary celebrant.
Now, we have this, which hopefully will stump you, because that's the goal of the show. Archimandrite Raphael Caroline makes a distinction between Lucifer, Belial, and Beelzebub and Asmodeus as four separate demonic entities, rather than different masks of the one Satan figure. Thoughts?
I've certainly not seen anything in the Fathers that would support that view. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing what he has to say, but Beelzebub basically is just sort of a play on a title for Baal that changed it from, you know, some exalted title to Lord of the Flies. And so it was used interchangeably with the word, you know, Satan or the devil. And Asmodeus may very well be a particular demon from, you know, the book of Tobit, but Beelzebub and the devil seem to be pretty clearly identified in the Bible.
Yeah, it sounds like, if one were to take that theory, it almost sounds like a cherubim, but like the antithesis, right? It's got four faces or something. I don't know.
Right.
I haven't run into it, so I can't say I have any opinions about it either. Right. We have this question. To what extent is it appropriate to venerate uncanonized Orthodox people privately and ask their intercessions? Does there have to be a clear cult of said person, like Dostoevsky, for example?
Well, I think that we can ask for the prayers of people that we consider to be saints before they're glorified, but you don't do that liturgically.
I would also add, don't stop praying for people that aren't canonized because they might need your prayers.
Right. But liturgically, at least in the Russian tradition, if you were seeking the prayers of someone who you consider to be a saint before they're glorified, rather than asking for a moleben to that saint or intercessory service where you're asking overtly for that saint's prayers, you actually do a panikhida. So you're praying for them, but the belief is that if they're already a saint, the fact that you're praying for them inspires them to pray for you. And I was at St. John of Shanghai's glorification, and actually the last thing they did prior to the vigil before they glorified him officially as a saint was they did the last panikhida. So, when you read the life of Father Seraphim Rose, he talks about doing panikhidas for St. John, but as a means of asking St. John to pray for him. So that's the more traditional way to do it liturgically. But at home or privately, you can ask for their prayers. And that's one of the ways we find out whether someone's glorified or by God is when people ask for their prayers, do they answer? So one of the things that the church is looking for is, are there miracles that are happening as a result of people asking for the prayers of this person? So clearly that means people are asking for their prayers before they're officially glorified, if that's a criteria that they use to glorify somebody.
Now, before we answer more questions, I want to do a quick break for you to give some plugs, because we got a captive audience. Where could people, I have linked below your YouTube channel for Saint Jonah and your church's YouTube, and you have your blog. Where could people follow up on you, Father?
Well, Father spelled out john.blogspot.com. I also have a Substack now where I post the same articles I post on my blog to the Substack.
Why is everyone going to Substack, Father? I don't get it. It seems like a worse version of what already existed. Yeah, people used to have, IamMe.com, and now it's become IamMe.substack.com. But people want the Substack. I don't get it.
Well, there are some things about Substack that you can do that you can't do with Blogspot. For example,
charge people money.
Well, I mean, you can share other people's articles on your, and you actually can charge, for subscriptions. I haven't done that, but I'm subscribed to some people on Substack. That's actually how I set up a Substack account.
There you go.
One other nice feature about Substack is when you post an article, it automatically gets emailed to all the people who are subscribed. Whereas Blogspot doesn't do that.
I don't get it. I don't get it, Father.
Yeah. So, and you can come to the Ledwell conference on September the 12th.
There
you
you
get to see me in person. And Jay Dyer will be there.
And there you go. And you get to see Jay Dyer and accost him in his apologetics retirement, which I guess isn't, because he's still doing, he was just on Tucker Carlson, which it's just like these crossovers you thought would never happen. It's kind of like when Alex Jones went on Howard Stern. And it's sort of like, you thought it would never happen, but now we've seen everything we thought never happened actually happen. Right. So there you go, Tucker Carlson. And
I hope Tucker Carlson winds up becoming Orthodox. I think he's clearly interested in Orthodoxy. I noticed that when I was watching the show that he did with Jay Dyer, that there was an icon on his shelf behind him.
Oh, I mean, I know he's in personal touch with Father Peter and Father Peter's brother, so I don't see why not. But also he has a libertarian streak, and this is one of those ironies where like a lot of libertarians are, for some cultural reason, drawn to orthodoxy, but it's completely out of step with actual libertarian political ideology. So it's kind of hard to square that circle. And Dr. Bradshaw will be there. So you could go to that conference. You got a bunch of money. I want you to support missionary work. OrthodoxChristianTheology.com/donate to support the missionary work in Cambodia. We have a full-time missionary, And quite frankly, the Manhattan Project of Orthodox missions of Cambodia might be near done. My wife and I have been working on a dictionary, a theological dictionary for the Khmer language. Just so people are aware, it's because a lot of terms have no existence in the Khmer language. Like they don't have a word for infidel. They don't have the word for pagan. They don't exist. They don't have a lot of theological terms that are Christian. They're Buddhist instead. They're explicitly Buddhist. So you have to actually take a lot of time to make a theological vocabulary. And the Manhattan Project is to then take this vocabulary, AI train it, and make it where we could do AI translations and then touch up those AI translations. It would greatly increase efficiency of translations for a lot of things. I've been asked from people I know in the real world, do you need money? No, not for that, because there's no money you could give from my wife and I to sit down and figure this stuff out. It's just something we have to sit down and do. Right. And we're near done. You give money, it doesn't make me think any faster. It doesn't make my wife translate. Right. It has nothing to do with it. But that money does help missionary work there. We have Hugh that's in Cambodia, is in Sihanoukville right now. So to support the missions of our full-time missionary, of our parish priest in Cambodia, we need money. And if you were to commit on Patreon, $5 or $10 a month, a lot of people, a lot of hands makes light work. So please support the missionary work, because if you're watching all this theology stuff and you have no care for missions, then what are we doing here? Another thing is consider becoming a missionary. Orthomission.com, the Prophet Daniel Missionary Movement. We're trying to organize members in North America and then organize people to the regions and facilitate actual missionary work. So if you're interested in becoming a missionary, don't just send your money, become a missionary. Orthomission.com. It costs nothing. It just costs your time, your devotion to be a missionary. And so there's more information there.
Are they doing anything in Spanish?
The Prophet Daniel Missionary Movement?
Right.
Not presently, no. We're just starting. We're starting to get members, and right now we all speak English, but we'd be happy to get people that speak Spanish and Portuguese.
I just recently became aware of a number of things that have been translated into Spanish, but the problem is they're done by somebody doing this on their own over here, and they do a small run, and nobody knows that it exists. So, like the Law of God by Father Seraphim Sobotskoy was published in a very nice edition by some parish in Miami, Florida. But I only found out about it because I was in San Antonio at the Saints Joachim and Anna parish, and they happened to have like 5 copies on their shelf. And then when I was in Canada recently, the prologue from Oakrid's been translated in Spanish. But again, small run, done by somebody in Colombia. Nobody knows that these things exist. We really need, somebody to start an organization where they start tying these projects together and, maybe helping to fund these publication projects so that they can get bigger runs and letting people know how to get them. Because there's a lot of these things available now. It's just that nobody knows.
Yeah, we had a donor in Cambodia give $1,500 for the publishing of the prayer book. And when we have a finished translation, we'll solicit donations for the remaining $1,500 who could do these runs. Right. We also plan on putting them on OrthodoxChristianCambodia.com. So there's digital versions so people could see what they paid for, that there's a real translation out there. Right. The physical books would only be in Cambodia unless we get those Cambodians in Long Beach to become Orthodox. Right. And the Coptic Orthodox have the best ground game there. So people are going to have to step up. We have Nathaniel, who is a great contributor. And so shout out to Nathaniel and to others, please. Links are below: Venmo, Patreon, and direct. Also, we have the PayPal that's in the care of the rector of the churches of Cambodia. So please donate, and that's greatly appreciated. We have this question. There is a recent dispute on Twitter as to whether or not it's correct to describe monasticism as better than marriage. Some say absolutely yes. Some say they're equally holy vocations. Your thoughts, Father?
I think I've seen more of the fathers and saints talking about it as being better in some sense. But the thing is, that doesn't denigrate marriage. It just means that there could be different levels of good. So marriage is good. being a monk is better, but it's not better if you're not called to it and you can't do it right. So those that are called to that, that's a wonderful thing. Not everybody's called to it. I'd say most people are not.
It seems like people are incapable of that distinction of good and better.
Right.
I remember posing the Protestants in 1 Corinthians 7. It's very clear that that abstinence and chastity is preferable to marriage. No, you can't possibly say that. I'm like, that's clearly what St. Paul is saying. But he says marriage is good. I'm like, yes, he says chastity is better. I'm a married man. I'm not saying, marriage is bad. It's just we'd be ignoring the very clear scriptures on this topic. And I don't think there's much more to be said. But good things could be done wrong.
Right.
So that it's not a justification of good things done wrong.
Right.
We have some misinformation and maybe clear up. We have Chivalry Bob. He says, when will ROCOR condemn the practice corrective baptism? The many ROCOR parishes practice, and this creates confusion with Rusty. So if I get baptized in the OCA, then want to say join a ROCOR parish, would they rebaptize me? If I was baptized in a canonical Orthodox church. So could he correct the record of these things, Father? Well,
I don't think that this is a common practice in ROCOR, with the exception of there are cases where a bishop will give a blessing to do a corrective baptism, and it could be for a couple of different reasons. One of them might be that maybe the person was received in a way that you can't justify at all, like the case of a ROCOR priest's wife that I knew that was received by chrismation in the OCA, and the baptism, if you want to call it that she got prior to that, was, I baptize you, Crystal. That was the baptism. Like the same way you'd christen a ship. I christen you the USS Bougainville. Well, that's not a Christian baptism. And so I think a corrective baptism in a case like that makes sense. I have heard of bishops giving blessings because you have somebody who's tormented by the thought that they were received improperly, and the bishop is doing it sort of as an act of economia to calm this person down. But I don't believe that our bishops are giving blessings to priests to just say, look, if somebody comes to you from the OCA and they were received by chrismation, just baptize them all. I don't think that that's what's happening.
Certainly what we don't have is the idea that you're received in one jurisdiction, that then some other jurisdiction will lock you out. That's never happened, period. That's just misinformation, or just not intentional, just someone misconstruing something. That's not the case. And, it's interesting. He wrote a letter before he passed away, Vlita Peter of blessed memory, about the issue of corrective baptism and against it per se. I'll say per se, because in the same letter, he states if there's some pastoral reason with the bishop's blessing, this could be done. And
so basically, he'd be willing to field your reasons as why you think it would be justified, but basically, as a rule, he would say no.
I actually know a priest who his criteria for even blessing someone to get it would be you have to already consider yourself fully Orthodox. What he doesn't want is you agonizing and being OCD. He doesn't see that as spiritually healthy. And so sadly, this is one of those issues that's been made into a needless debate. And I think this debate, even well-meaning people, which I'd consider on the right side, have in effect then crystallized opposition to people that weren't in opposition. Right. And so this is something where everyone needs to take a step back and care about the actual individuals and their pastoral needs. And I think a lot of it would settle out instead of overarching things. Well, if they have baptism, then they have Eucharist, and people go these directions, which they're not even connected, which shows to me, I think, a larger agenda.
I can tell you, I've never done a corrective baptism, and for me to even ask the bishop for a blessing to do one, it would have to be a case like, I baptize you, Crystal, or something like that, something that is not a Christian baptism by any stretch or definition. I have spent a lot of time trying to talk people out of feeling like they needed one, and my position has always been, and this is what Archbishop Peter also held to, which is that if someone was received in a way that maybe they shouldn't have been, that that was the judgment call the bishop that received them made, and it would have to be a pretty extreme case for us to second guess that judgment, because the bishop has the power to bind and to loose. And so if the bishop did something he shouldn't have done, then he's the one that's going to have to answer for that on the day of judgment, not the person that was obedient and was received the way their bishop told them to be received.
I think ultimately we'll have saints on both sides of this question. And sometimes when we have things like that, strict harmonizations aren't possible, but we'll see, I think, with hindsight, how the different views complement one another and how they address different pastoral needs.
Right.
We have this question. Do you believe, Father John, don't dodge the bullet like the Matrix, whether Jehovah's Witnesses can die and be saved as practicing Jehovah's Witnesses? Yes or no? Simple question.
I wouldn't say that it's impossible, because I think that's God's judgment. I mean, obviously they have heretical beliefs, but I don't think that whether someone's saved or not is whether they can pass, get 100 on a quiz on theology on the day of judgment. I think it's a matter of, are they responding to the light that they've been given? And, God's the one that has to judge that.
Yeah, I'll say simply to rehash what we already said before, heretics damned. Each individual heretic, give the name. I couldn't tell you. Trajan's in heaven. He was a pagan. He persecuted Christians. We leave that to God.
Right.
We have one in the audience saying, I pray for the monastic life for myself, God willing. You're taking the easy way out. I don't know about you Gen Xers, like you, Father John, and older generation. I say the married life is much harder than monks deal with. They have a much more carefree life.
Well,
one monk told me, my obedience is stopped when I sleep. When you're married, you have obediences when you're asleep. And that is true when you have kids.
Right. I mean, I think both paths have their struggles. And I think that a lot of people, particularly people who are new converts, it's easy to romanticize monasticism and to think that I'm going to go to a monastery where it's going to just be a spiritual Disneyland, and I'm going to be saying the Jesus prayer all day and achieve theosis and start feeding bears in the woods and all that kind of stuff. And that certainly can happen down the road.
But you never have, Father?
But I've not been feeding bears in the woods or anything.
Too bad.
The thing is, if you read the life of any monastic saint that goes in any great detail, you see that it's a life where they're struggling with people attacking them, judging. The monastic life is like any family life. You've got different personalities that have to try to get along with each other. And so you can be saved as in marriage, you can be saved in monasticism. There are certain advantages, to each life. And it all depends on what you're called to. And, some people are called to both eventually, because there's a lot of people who live a married life, and then at some point they, maybe their spouse passes away and they become a monastic.
Well, one of my pipe dreams is to bring up the kid, when I can't really do that much of a physical nature, all that useful, retire to a monastery, like when the Russian saints, there's tons of those.
Right.
I'm not saying I'm gonna do that, but it's something more I find I talk about every so often. So there you go.
Well, the food probably is a lot better at your house than it is at Jordanville, so that's something you got to weigh.
I'm sorry, I gotta qualify. If baptism is a matter, and by the way, Father Gabriel's cooking, he's a great cook at Jordanville. Now, if baptism,
but your wife is probably a better cook, I'm guessing.
Your wife's a great cook. Now that's it. If baptism, and she started not knowing about cooking. That was a very charming story. That you married her anyway after that.
Yeah, that's right.
If baptism is a matter of eternal life and death, why do we wait 40 days to baptize babies? Why not sooner? We have emergency baptisms for those cases. It's just
you can baptize a baby right out of the womb if it's if there's a need. But we wait 40 days for a number of reasons. One is that way the mom is able to attend the baptism, but also gives the baby a chance to mature enough to where the baptism is a little easier to do.
Now, I have no written authority in this. I'll just give my totally baseless opinion. If I didn't have a platform, it means nothing. All right, nothing. But here's my real opinion. Wait the day 40 unless it's emergency, because I've seen in my own life, I do think there's spiritual effects. I've seen my son after baptism, things get so much easier for him. And I've seen when the rule violated, things get more difficult for other people, because there's prayers for other things that revolve around the baptism and for the mother and things like this. So it's I'm kind of a stickler. If my son were to ask me, I go, you better wait the day 40, but I've got no real doctrinal reason for it. It's just my opinion. So I'll just leave it at that. We have I asked the question about false union because I'm in a Greek parish, and I'm wondering if you have any advice or tips in terms of what to do if you're in the same situation. I'd say you go to the best possible parish. There's no perfect jurisdiction. There's no perfect parish even. Yeah. You just do what's best for your family.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to just give you a blanket answer to that question, because there are lots of really excellent priests in the Greek Archdiocese. I'm friends with several of them. And, they're much better priests than I am.
No.
But on the other hand, you've got, let's say you live right across the street from a Rokor parish, but you were not a Russian and the service was mostly in Slavonic. That might be a very difficult parish for you to be in. Well, if the only alternative was a Greek parish down the road, that would be a difficult call. And it would depend a lot on what was going on in that parish as to whether or not, if I was you, that I would decide to go to that parish. I mean, I did go to a mostly Slavonic parish for several years, but that was after I'd been Orthodox for a few years. So I already knew what Orthodoxy was, and I was willing to deal with that for those years that I was there. And I benefited a lot from that. So I think that there's something to be said for that. And I do think that down the road, it's a high likelihood that the EP is going to wind up going into full schism and joining in a false union with Rome. So personally, I wouldn't want to be sinking my time and effort into a parish that might wind up having, even if let's say the priest is 100% Orthodox, and let's say that when it comes to that, he says, I'm not going along with you. Well, the thing is, if the Greek Archdiocese owns that property, he might be starting from scratch somewhere else when that's all hitting the fan. I would rather be in a parish where I didn't have to worry about that. So if there was a Rokor parish that I could go to, that's where I would suggest. But, there are other jurisdictions that have good parishes. The OCA and the Antiochians also have very good parishes and very good priests. So it just depends. Your mileage will vary.
Like if you're going to go by best jurisdiction, like if you're going to go all the boxes, it'd be Bulgaria or Georgia, and I'd say Georgia. Right. But that Georgian church might not be the best for you. Not that there's a lot in the United States, quite frankly. Wilkes-Barre.
I have a very soft spot in my heart for the Serbs, but I know that they can be pretty iffy when it comes to actual Orthodox practice.
Oh, yeah.
But like the joke that I believe I've repeated to you, there was a Serbian priest. He actually is back in Galveston now, but he told me this joke, probably more than a decade ago. But, there was a Greek, a Russian, a Serb in a bar, and the Greek said, we Greeks gave the church great theology. And the Russian said, well, we Russians gave the great church great music. And the Serb said, well, we Serbs don't really understand our faith, but we'll fight to the death for it. And I thought, well, okay, that's a funny joke. When COVID happened, I thought, well, this really is something. There's a lot more to this joke than I thought, because the Serbs were the only church in the United States that had no parishes where they made them shut down. In Rokor, it varied by diocese, and I don't think any of them actually shut down. But like our diocese, we were limited to 10 people for like 5 Sundays.
The Serbs are more supportive of you being creative and being accommodating. I'll
right.
put it loosely like that.
The only parish in Houston that did not have any limitations on Pascha of that year was the Serbian parish in Galveston. I'm not sure what was going on with the other Serbian parish in Cyprus, but I think that I know the bishop didn't put any restrictions on them. I'm not sure if the priest puts any restrictions on himself or not. But I know the Serbian parish, they didn't do anything. That was the only place you could go and not have to, have any problems whatsoever. Although well, I shouldn't repeat those because I don't want to get anybody into trouble. There was one other place, and I'm told thousands of people were communed.
There we go, thousands.
I'm serious. I'm not making this up. But
it definitely wasn't
more than 1,000. More than 1,000 people were communed at this one place, which shall remain nameless.
Well, I'm going to necro bump something we're saying because I just remembered when we talked about like older practices or practices that are becoming lost that should be brought back, but not in a weird way. I think a good example of this is one of your fellow priests a couple hours away in Father Moses' church. They put tasteful signage in front of the sanctuary that speaks of proper dress and where you should stand. And it recommends, like, there's no police. Hopefully one day we'll get babushkas, but they have to get old enough for us to be a babushka. Right. Men and women one side, and it says families all the way in the back, kind of that reality that you're gonna have kids and you got to be near the door to get them out and things like this. And like in a monastery, when my son was younger, my wife would be like right here to the left, right on the woman's side. I'd be right here on the right on the men's side, and the kids almost straddling in the middle. So even in a monastery, you could ride that line if you have to.
Right.
But it was a totally normal, feasible, respectful way to do it. And that's what we should be doing for any of these things. I'm not just giving up or something like that. So just a shout out to Father Moses, who, people just know him for his videos and stuff, but like he has a vibrant real world parish, and they're doing things like that definitely the right way. And I know because my godson's there. I've recently heard that getting icons blessed by a priest is a late accretion is violating the 6th and 7th Ecumenical Council's thoughts. Now, I just want to clarify, because Father, it depends what he means. There's people that bring the icon and they want to just put it in the altar, but there's also in some service books actual ceremonies where you could put chrism on the icons.
I've never heard of that, but you sprinkle holy water on icons.
No, there's actual stuff with chrism. Father Stephen Bigham speaks about this and quotes some of it.
I've never heard of that.
That being said, it's just like there's a lot of stuff we don't do here that was, I'd say, pretty aberrant in the 17 and 1800s. Right? We obviously don't have Orthodox indulgences anymore, which they're not quite like the Roman Catholic indulgence, but there's these absolution certificates. We don't do that anymore.
I don't think it was ever done universally, but it might have been done in some places.
It was done a lot, though. That being said, we don't, I forget the word for it. It's like a kind of like dedicated meal, which is essentially almost an animal sacrifice. That used to exist and very common. Some synods even issued statements endorsing it. Doesn't exist anymore. And just so you know, there's people like St. Nicodemus, the Higurite, that are absolutely against this stuff. But the fact that they had to speak out against it's because it was out there.
Right.
Now, so that being said, to have an actual blessing ceremony, if you're going to put chrism on an icon, is absolutely wrong. One, the 7th Council explicitly says we're not like the pagans that do ceremonies for the images, that their power comes from what they depict, not like some sort of ceremony where you fill them with the Spirit, which is what the pagans did with their idols. And so it's regrettable that the obvious lessons of the 7th Council were forgotten in some corners for some period of time. The fact that you can't find anyone doing it means it's not that common anymore. It's probably totally in disuse. But I don't want people to freak out if they do enough sleuthing, they run into some of this stuff.
Well, in the Book of Needs published by St. Tikans and the Slavonic Book of Needs, there are blessing services for icons, but they're just prayers that include sprinkling the icons with holy water. And
you put holy water on everything.
Right. I mean, we also bless, plates that we use for communion. We spoons, spears. We bless the chalice. So we bless everything. So basically, the blessing of an icon inaugurates it as now we're going to use this liturgically. But I know the Greeks don't practice this. And the way I look at it is, I don't think the icon's less holy if it's not blessed, but I don't think that it hurts to bless it, just like we bless all these other things that we bless. And there's a Greek priest who was in the Orthodoxy and Dixie video, Father Anastasia Trellis. So he's a Greek from Charleston, so he has this wonderful accent. And I remember hearing his comment on this: how can you add any blessing to an image of the Savior? well, I agree with his sentiment. I think that it's a holy image regardless of whether it's blessed or not, but I think the blessing service, and the Greeks actually do have the icons brought into the altar for some period of time, typically. So that there is that. But I think it's a nice service to basically say, okay, now we're going to start using this icon liturgically, and we're blessing it.
Now we're going to have to do some rapid fire because we're running out of time. Quick comment, Father. I just received a new Bible from New Rome, and it contains the book of Enoch. What's your opinion on its inclusion?
I would view it as an appendix that's of historical significance, but I would not consider it a canonical book.
It's not a canonical book, but First Enoch has a lot of very good theology in it, and some of the earliest attestations of prayers to the angels. It's one of those things of people actually read it and they would go, wait a second, there's prayers to angels here, and then wait a second, it's quoted by an apostle, the book of Jude. Well, it's because that's the sort of stuff we were doing. It shouldn't even be debated. Do you know any plans of a new Bible translation in Russian from the Septuagint being done?
I'm not aware of one, but it wouldn't surprise me if there is one. But with a little bit of effort, a Russian speaker could learn how to read Slavonic, and the Slavonic Bible has been in print since not long after the King James Bible was published. I have a copy.
There you go. We have this comment. There's no proof Trajan is heaven. It says he's forgiven. That's it. I'm speaking from memory. So I'll let you have the last word on that. But all of us,
I believe the language is something along the lines of him being delivered from Hades or hell.
The fact that, and there's a book, hopefully it'll be published in English. The fact that Father George Maximoff at pains gets into the textual history and what's changed in the hagiography in which to polemically discredit the idea he's in heaven leads me to believe that there's obviously published editions that make that pretty clear. But by all means, people wanting more history that they get their hands on Father George Maximoff's books, please do so. And that there's a video of Father George and I, No Salvation Outside the Church, where he gets into a lot of these details. So by all means, check that out.
There are other saints, though, that quote this story, too, though. So it's not just the hagiography, though. It's other saints. I think St. John of Damascus references it.
Now, Father John, I desire to start my church one day. Is that something good for the church?
It depends on what you mean by that. If you're in an area where you don't have an Orthodox parish and you want to try to get one started, and you're working with your bishop, I think there's nothing wrong with that. But if by starting your own church you mean you want to start the first church of Billy Bob Thornton or whatever, I would say no, that's not a good idea.
Wait. With Billy Bob Thornton, so it's just a problem, even if Billy Bob Thornton wants to be Orthodox.
No, the first church of Billy Bob Thornton.
Okay. Okay. So it's not just a thing against Billy Bob Thornton.
Nothing against Billy Bob Thornton himself.
All right. So I don't need trouble with Billy Bob Thornton. That's all. We have this, Father John. I wanted to ask, what do you think is the future of the true Orthodox schism, especially because the GOCK and ROCAR increasingly look more in support of Cyprian's position, which I presume is that it's not the graceless one. I'm not quite sure what he's referring to.
Well, I think that the Russian church has always held the view that the Orthodox Church is the church. I'm not sure if what he's trying to get at is that the Greeks, the Greek old counters consider themselves to be the totality of the church, and that everybody outside of them is in heresy or whatever. I would hope that we have some clarity that results if we do see a schism where the ecumenical patriarchate goes into union with Rome. I do think that you're going to see a lot of jurisdictions dividing over that. And I think the ones that don't go along with that schism are likely going to be the best people in those jurisdictions. At the end of the day, I would hope that what emerges from that would make it easier for people who are Greek Old Calendarists to reconcile.
This is an issue where, like, I feel I've been the only guy with a decent platform to actually be nice to these people and platform them. And this includes you. And sadly, we've not really been given a good shake for that. All I can say is what I've seen in the real world, and I can only comment in GOCK, is that they'll be blessed to commune in ROCOR parishes. And I know that comes from the bishop. And I won't get to any more details. And I won't say which bishop. It's just kind of irrelevant. These things occur just like in ROCOR. You could be blessed to get a blessing from a GOCK priest or bishop. These are things which, because the internet, we all have to pick a side, which is kind of strange, being that most people that are that invested in it are converts and recent at that. We're not in it for decades like Father John, that you get kind of disconnected from what's really going on the ground and the people that have been in this for decades. Now, if you want my opinion, this will change very radically, probably within 10, 20 years when all the old timers go and they get replaced by people that are more with the inclinations of the more hard edge sort of view that we see well represented on the internet, like the subdeacon Nectarius types that will deny reality, right? That like we ROCOR had a Serbian priest during Father John Maximovich's glorification, St. John Maximovich, and things of that nature, that there's a concelebration in Jerusalem and things like this, where you'll even have the true Orthodox against other true Orthodox on the question, which is a shame because we should just call it like we see it. There's things they've done, there's things they've done. It depends on jurisdiction, depends on the bishop. All these things occurred. But people don't like things that aren't neat and tidy. And so they want kind of simpler answers than what the truth is. As for union, my guess is it will be no, sadly. I really do want reconciliation of GOCK. But if that were occurred, there'd be a schism within the GOCK, and that's probably why it hasn't even occurred yet. So,
yeah, I think it's unlikely that you'd see the entirety of the Greek Old Calendar movement reconciling with the church, because I think there are a lot of parallels with the old believers, and they don't like that comparison. But I think that sociologically, there's a lot of comparisons to be made.
And let's be fair to them. What's happening within the EP? I'll just say within the MP, a lot of big jurisdictions, more than half the Orthodox Church, very aberrant things where they're going to be so compelled that they have to enter communion with it.
The thing is, in the EP, there are aberrant things that go on a regular basis, and in the Moscow Patriarchate, you might be able to point to an incident here or there where you could say, well, that was kind of questionable. But the official policies of the Russian Church on like ecumenical activities are almost identical to the policies that ROCOR had back under Metropolitan Filaret.
I'll just say, other than the Greeks and the Arabs, because people point to them all the time, there are other jurisdictions which are based in trad that have communion blessed by bishops with the monophysites and things like this. This stuff does exist. If people find out about it and no one's ever told them, they're going to have a freak out, but they exist. And so I'm not saying this to justify the GOCK. I'm not in their jurisdiction, but I very well understand why they wouldn't feel like rushing at the door to want to enter the communion when these are the things that do exist. And, my hope.
But the thing is in the church history, there's always been some messy stuff going on at some place in the church. And so if you were to apply the same criteria to almost any other point in church history, you'd be able to say, well, look, they're in communion with this bishop over here who's doing this questionable thing. So therefore, they've got the canonical cooties from that other bishop, and I can't be in communion with them.
And that's absolutely correct.
Right.
It's this sort of Donatist tendency that somehow holy orders and grace depend upon the holiness of the individual. And this then justifies schismatic activity, which I have a good long show of this on the history of the non-Chalcedonian schism. But the same canons apply to the Jew Orthodox, because it applies to all of us, that you cannot, without the majority of the synod, start consecrating new bishops. There's a reason why the original Greek Old Calendarist movement, who was absolutely correct, we've had shows on this, they were absolutely correct, didn't ordain bishops. It's when they started to that there started problems, because it did so without their synod. And so it's a larger issue. We're obviously not going to solve it in this show. I understand where they're coming from, but I would say to them, this is not to own them or something like that. Look at those canons and how it applies to the Oriental Orthodox, how it applies to the Donatists, and then look at yourselves. And then just so you could see why we feel the way we do. And we have canonical synods. You don't. And that is a major problem.
Well, if you look at what happened with the old believers, but I think it was sometime in the 19th century, maybe it was even before that the Russian church began allowing the old rite to be used, and they were trying to bring old believers back into the church. And then back in the 1970s, the Moscow Patriarchate and then Rokor both issued statements apologizing to old believers for the way they were treated historically at the time of the schism, because they were not treated well. So if you compare that like with the old calendarists, when you look at the way the state church of Greece dealt with the old calendarist at the time that the new calendar was introduced, there was a lot of unjustifiable things that happened there. But the thing is, you could say the same thing about the Russian church and the old believers. And so if you're going to apply the same logic, you would say, well, the old believers are the true people, and the Russian church, they're, modernist schismatics. And then you have to dismiss all the saints that arose in the Russian church since that time. But you had a lot of old believers that were reconciled to the church in the 19th century. And then you started having more and more old right people that came into the church and were reconciled. But there are still old believers that will not move on. And what Father Pieman Simon said back in 2006, when they had the All Diaspora Council to talk about reconciliation with the Moscow Patriarchate, he warned the people who were objecting to reconcile with Moscow, and he said, you're doing exactly what the old believers did. The old believers kept moving the goalpost. Whatever the Russian church did, they would say, but you haven't done this yet. Russian church did that. Like I think when they allowed the old rite, thing they were saying was, well, they need to apologize for what they did to us. Okay, well, now they've apologized. But they need to do this too. So you can always find some new thing that they haven't done yet that, until they do that, you can't reconcile. And I'm afraid for some old calendarists, that's probably what's going to continue to happen.
Yeah,
there was always going to be a justification.
It's a spirit of schism there, where people want division. But again, that doesn't mean all people don't have good, valid grounds and doctrinal grounds for a lot of their concerns. But of course, if we were to neglect that, aren't also these other tendencies that wouldn't be honest either.
Right.
We have Nathaniel saying, I would really hate to leave my home, his Greek church, but refuse to be in union papacy. Well, if that happens, then do the right thing. Just don't stress out about it for the moment. We have you ever been to the Holy Land, Father? Or do you want to go?
I've been to the Holy Land once. I'd like to go back because I didn't get to see everything I wanted to see. But it was a wonderful trip. And when you see where things happen in the Bible, it gives you a totally different perspective when you read it the next time. Like I got to see from the Mount of Olives where Bethany was in relationship to the old city of Jerusalem, and see the road that Christ would have taken when he came from Bethany to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. It gives you a very different perspective on that. And we drove, I didn't get to go on Mount Tabor, but we drove past it. And not only is Mount Tabor famous for the Transfiguration, but it's also in the book of Judges, where the Israelites charged down the side of Mount Tabor to attack the Canaanites. And when when you see what Mount Tabor looks like, you can imagine these Israelites coming down the side of that mountain. It gives you a different perspective. So it's really amazing to see that stuff. So I'd encourage everyone to go if they can. Right now might not be the best time to go, just because we have an on again, off again war going on. I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of a Iranian missile attack.
Yeah, it's regrettable. Based off your knowledge, which Oriental jurisdiction would be the first to join the Orthodox Church? Ethiopians, Armenians, Syriac Orthodox?
I mean, it's hard to say, but I would think the Ethiopians might be higher up on the list, but it's hard to say. I mean, I know that they're, the Russian Church actually has been talking to these people from long before the Bolshevik Revolution, so this is not some new modernist thing. And before the revolution, there actually were a number of Nestorian and Monophysite groups that were reconciled to the church. So that's not ecumenism in the heretical sense of the term. That's just the church trying to bring people back into the fold.
I mean, it's, of course, with God, all things are possible. They don't look very likely. So
Right.
Even answering this question requires some speculation. We don't want the fire eaters on the other side to freak out too much when they hear some just speculation. Obviously, when this comes to the average person, how they feel, clearly the Ethiopian Orthodox, they're not even aware there's a division. They're not very invested in the division. I think if they were aware of kind of like how artificially imposed this division was during the Middle Ages and stuff, and that they, in fact, do have holy orders like the Armenians, while the Syriac Orthodox and at least canonically speaking, I'm not God to make the judgment, and the Syriac Orthodox and the Coptic Orthodox do not. They have some of our saints, not a lot though, but there'd be more grounds for them to have union and less of a ethnic aversion to it because they weren't invested in these issues that happened so many centuries ago. That said, I think the dark horse and more likely is actually the Armenians, because a lot of this stuff, as we say in New York, could change in a New York minute based on the geopolitics of Russia, Turkey, and things like this. Armenia is just geographically closer to Russia. They've definitely taken steps back now with Azerbaijan acquiring lands in Armenia, which Russia sat in their hands, did absolutely nothing. So the Russian version of NATO stinks.
Well, the Armenians didn't ask for any help though either. I mean, the thing is, the
Russians were going to give it. Let's be honest.
Well, the thing is, the Armenians weren't even defending their own territory, so why would they expect the Russians to defend something they weren't able to attend?
I'm not a big fan of Russia geopolitically. I like Russian Orthodoxy, but that being said, it's that might not be true 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where Russia wins the war in Ukraine, and that leads to a dissolution. I'm not saying it's going to happen. And if that led to a dissolution of NATO, and if things like this were to come to pass, that then Armenia might actually grow much closer to the Russian orbit, and this could lead to ecclesiastical overtures. And this also could happen with problems with Iran and Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Russia more stepping into that role. We have a prophecy, allegedly St. Pavsos, of Russia retaking Constantinople. And all I can say, the only way that occurs due to birth rates and all this stuff is if a nuclear war breaks out. And if that occurs, nothing's off the table. So there, I'd say dark horse for Armenia. Father Daniel Sazoyev was a proponent of the ritual hypothesis, and he's a future saint. So I'll just leave that as a comment. Seraphim Webster says, recently ended my 1.5 long catechism to be reconciled with the church. Keep me in your prayers. It's a crazy amount of people in true Orthodoxy who consider me an apostate now. So I'm guessing that he became true Orthodox for a while. And I don't know, just keep your heart in the right place. Pray, do the fast. And try not to be sucked into this negative vortex. Not everyone's like you, Father John. You could be on Twitter without becoming a nut. I think a lot of people get sucked into this negative vortex. So we need more people like you who don't. I've disconnected from Twitter almost entirely. I'd say 90%, simply because I don't see any positive out of it. So if you could partake of it in a positive way, I think that's great. So that's my comments. I think a lot of this revolves around Twitter controversies. So Father's got no comments on that. So let's see, we got one more comment Are there women deacons in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church? Not that I'm aware of. And we'll end with this one before we do our final plugs. Love Father John Whiteford. Thanks for this episode, Craig. So you have the love of the audience. So Father John, last opportunity. We have more people on for plugs.
Well, parish website is saintspelledoutjonah.org. Blogspot account is fatherspelledoutjohn.blogspot.com. I have a Substack, and my sermons are now posted by the Union of Orthodox Journalists, so they're on YouTube as well as Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all that stuff.
And again, if this has blessed you, please bless the missionary work in Cambodia. Even a donation of $1 makes a difference. If everyone who watches gave $1, it'd make a huge difference. So orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links are below. Patreon for monthly contributors, PayPal and Venmo. Please bless the church in Cambodia. And God will bless you. And consider becoming a missionary, orthomission.com. Well, Father John, this has been fun. We will, I'm sure, have a response video yet again to something that demands it. But it's fun to do a Stump the Priest and just take time to unpack so many different topics. I really appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you for having me on.
And audience, thank you for watching. And I'll end this show as I end all of them by quoting Jesus Sirach. Fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.